Hi folks, it's James from Woodland Classroom here, out in the woods today, and in this video we're going to go through some safety tips and best practice techniques for using saws out in the woods. And I hope these are going to be really useful for anyone who works in the woods themselves or leads groups in woodland skills activities, whether it's forest school or bushcraft sessions. And these are safety tips and techniques that we've picked up over the years and that we use in our own woodland activity sessions. Before we get into the techniques themselves, let's just take a moment to understand the hazard that's going on here specific to saws and the difference between cutting yourself with a knife and cutting yourself with a saw. Now, you might have heard an old phrase, a sharp tool is safer than a blunt tool. And hopefully you're keeping all your tools sharp when you're using them with yourself or with groups. Now, a single edge blade like this knife here, if it cuts you, it should be a nice clean cut. Of course, there's nothing nice about being cut with your own knife, is there? But it should at least be clean. And what that means is if you've got a nice clean cut, then it's easier to push the skin back together with steri strips or to put pressure on it to stem the bleeding until you can get further help. And a nick with a knife isn't always the end of the world. A nick with a saw, or even worse, a cut with a saw, is bad news, and it can be game over if you're working with a group outdoors, because a saw of course has teeth, not a single edge, and teeth tear skin. They don't cleanly cut it open, and that's going to create a messy wound, and that's a trip to A&E, and that's end of play for your activities. So the emphasis on these techniques is all about keeping that blade away from our bodies and away from our offhand. That's what we're going to be doing with these techniques. You know, I've just realised I'm going to get some comments about this plaster on my finger with this video. There's quite an irony there, isn't there? But I assure you it wasn't done with a saw blade. So you can see the obvious hazard here, especially with the wood being able to move a little bit on the stump. It's not that stable. Then there's a few too many factors that could bring the saw onto the back of our offhand. And this is where a lot of people might then reach for a glove for the offhand. And a glove of course is PPE, personal protective equipment, but putting on a glove or any kind of safety gear should be the last option, the last resort in reducing a hazard. There are smarter things that we can do. Let's just think about what protection the glove does or doesn't give for a minute, because you know, people tend to think, I've got a glove on, oh it's magic, it will stop any cuts. Now this glove is leather all the way round. For a little nick, it is probably going to stop it. But for anything with any force, it could go right through the leather. And if you think about most rigger gloves that people use with group activities, they might have leather on the front, but often it's cloth on the back, and it's the cloth that's exposed to the blade, not the leather. So for a start there's really no protection with the glove. So we can be much smarter to keep that offhand away from the blade. Let me show you how. So the first technique is to ask a question. Do you need to use the saw at all? And this is an exercise in switching our brains on into the right mode to be safety conscious and to be smart when we're out in the woods. Because if we don't have to reach for that sharp tool, then we're eliminating the hazard completely, aren't we? So if we want to break this wood up for firewood, we don't need a clean cut, do we, that we get with a saw. We can just snap it. And let's use a device like this. Rather than stamping on it with our foot, we can use a tree that's bifurcated. It's got two trunks, and we can put the piece of wood we want to break in the gap between. And then of course, using this natural vise, we just apply pressure. Nice clean cut. And for firewood, that's absolutely fine. Nice and easy, and we've avoided using the saw completely. And a bifurcated trunk like this is going to continue to be useful for us for another technique of safe saw use. We're going to use it as a vise, sticking the wood in between like that, get the saw out, and now we have not one, but two barriers between the blade and my offhand. No need for a glove whatsoever. And with a bit of pressure as I pull back with my offhand, that holds the work in place. And this is a great method actually if you're working with groups of less able-bodied people, because they might not be able to kneel down on a low stump, find it hard to get on and off the floor. But this they can do standing up. We're back down on the ground now, and we're using this fallen log here as a bench to lift the piece of wood we want to saw off the floor. But again, we've got the same problem. Here, I'm holding it and there is a chance with the saw that it could jump over to my offhand. But let's put a barrier in place, and this is where having a friend really helps. So if we bring that in there, we're going to pop that up against there. Your friend puts some weight on it, and then they're effectively doing the same job as the tree was earlier. We can saw on this side. It's not going to jump over to me, and it's way too far to jump over to your partner either. And we put that barrier between the saw and the offhand. For anyone working with groups, this technique is a great way to tie up two people at once, especially if you're working with larger groups and you don't want all of them to have a saw. They can work in pairs, one on the stick here and one with the tool. Now it's important that this upright goes on the near side of the piece of work, because most of these saws cut on the pull, so that's when on the pull it's being held in place. On the other side, your piece of work is going to move around a lot more. And if you haven't got a friend to hand, you can still use this technique. Just make a pointed stake and knock that in the ground to create your barrier. Now if you've got a more permanent base camp, then you can build a device like this. It's called a sawhorse. We've just made this one out of lengths of hazels, nothing too complicated. But of course it's doing that same job of putting a barrier between your offhand and the blade, and also it allows you to work standing up, and you can support quite long lengths and heavy lengths of timber on here nice and safely. Okay, let's switch up the scenario a bit. You haven't got a sawhorse to hand, you haven't got a friend in the woods with you, and you haven't got a bifurcated tree. All you've got is a fallen log or a rock to rest your piece of wood on. Let's change it up and see what we can do in this situation to reduce the risk. So in this situation, we could make use of our boots. And I've got a heavy leather boot here, which is going to offer some protection against the saw blade here. But look, there's a hazard. When the saw goes all the way through the wood, it's going to come back and potentially hit my leg here. It'll be the same if we're using a swinging tool like an axe. We always want to think about the follow through. So let's swap them around. Keep the blade, the saw, to the outside of your body. Keep the tip pointed down, and then we can run it along the side of the boot like that. And when we come through the wood, it comes into dead space there. We're not going to hit our body there, and we've reduced the hazard as much as we can. So far we've been using a pruning saw and a folding saw, but let's take it up a notch. Let's introduce this bow saw here. This has got a 21-inch blade. It's a bigger beast all round, and it's got larger teeth, so the potential for harm is greater as well if these teeth come into contact with your skin. Now, there's a couple of techniques that I've seen often taught with this to use, which I don't personally get on with. And if you like these techniques and get on fine with them, by all means, I'm not telling you not to do it, but I don't teach these ones, I don't like them, and I'll tell you why. Let me show you what I mean first. Here's the first technique I often see. So, with your boot on the wood there, holding it in place, you see people put their arm through the hole in the bow saw there, and then use that as a way, as a barrier, to stop the bow saw blade from jumping upwards. You know what? I don't like this. It feels very awkward. It feels much more natural to want to use my left foot in this situation. I'm not twisting my body as much, but now, of course, if the bow saw comes backwards when we finish sawing, it's coming back to this leg here, and we've come back to the problem we had a moment ago. Here's the other technique that I see. When the saw's a good way into the piece of wood, you see people put a thumb over the gap and they can saw away. This again is a way of stopping the blade from jumping up, like that, you see. Again, I don't like this. Here's why I don't teach those methods for myself. Now traditionally the back of the blade should not be sharp. However, it can get nicks and burrs if it gets damaged through heavy use or with accidents. Now if you're working on your own, you've just got your one saw, your own kit, and you're proficient with it, that's less likely to happen. But if you're working with groups and the tools get lent around the group and they're a bit more heavy-handed with them, then there's more of a chance of an accident happening there. And perhaps if you've got a nick or burr and that then runs along the underside of your forearm or on the tip of your thumb, you're going to know about it pretty quick. It's going to be pretty messy. So I don't like to use those techniques myself. But if you get on with those and you've used them and had success, by all means, crack on. One last word about the bow saws. These guards that go over the blades here that often come with the saws, they're cheap, kind of nasty hard plastic, easy to get lost in the leaf litter, and they break easily too. You can make your own quite easily using the foam insulation that goes over pipes from the plumbing industry. Just cut it to length, put a slot down it, and it goes over the whole blade there. It's chunkier, it can take a bit more abuse, and when the blade goes into the bag, you're not going to put your hands against any of the teeth there. So a little top tip for making your own sheath. Something else that's worth bearing in mind is the condition of the blade as well. This is a Laplander folding saw and the blades are replaceable. So if you're finding it's hard work sawing with your tool, especially if it gets used a lot with groups, it might well be time to replace the blade. So don't forget to think about doing that. Well, that's our safe tips and techniques for using a saw out in the woods. And I must give a shout out to Dave Watson at Woodland Survival Crafts for introducing me to some of these techniques in the first place. So thanks, Dave, for sharing the wisdom. And if you found these techniques useful, please do share the video with others, give the video a like, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more good stuff. If we missed any tips out, then please share them in the comments. Same goes if you hated some of the techniques seen here. Let us know why, let us know how you would do things differently. It all enriches the learning community. Well, that's all from me, folks. Thanks for watching and stay safe out in the woods. See you soon.